Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron, your balding beardless friend here, and today what we're going to do is go through some data from previous leagues as we make some predictions about strong league starters for the upcoming 321 Crucible League. There are timestamps right here on your screen if you want to jump around or revisit any of the particular builds that we discuss or any of the numbers that we go over, and there's of course video chapters as well as links and references to everything that we're going to cite down below in the video description. To help fill out the rest of the week as we build excitement and anticipation for the upcoming 321 Crucible League, we've got 3 more discussions planned for you to come out, one each day in anticipation and countdown for the upcoming league launch. If any of the video topics displayed in the background here look intriguing or interesting to you, or you enjoy the discussion today, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions, sort of similar-ish to this one. To begin our discussion today, we need to take a look at what was popular during last league start during the Forbidden Sanctum. All of the numbers that we are looking at and comparing from last league, we took during our meta snapshot that we typically do on league launch, and within the first 7 days, another second meta snapshot across the board in softcore trade league, in hardcore trade league, in solo self-found, as well as hardcore solo self-found. Across all forms of playing Path of Exile and the multiple different expressions of POE that now exist, these were some of the skills that emerged as the most popular amongst players' choices for league starters. Seismic Trap, Explosive Arrow, Righteous Fire, Venom Gyre, Vortex, generally indicating Cold Dot as an archetype, Poisonous Concoction, and Summon Raging Spirits. Those are 7 skills that emerged during the first week of Forbidden Sanctum as particularly strong builds for league starters that were able to take content on early and often and then push with investment within the first week of players engaging with the new league mechanic and pushing for experience on the ladder. So out of those 7 skills, out of Explosive Arrow, Seismic Trap, Righteous Fire, Summon Raging Spirits, Cold Dot, Poisonous Concoction, and Venom Gyre, what exactly of those 7 different builds is still viable for the ongoing and upcoming 321 Crucible League? Let's take a look at these 7 skills and a couple of different content creators and build guide experts for how they are tweaking and recommending changing their approaches to these particular skills with the upcoming 321 Crucible. First up, let's chat really briefly about Seismic Trap, which of course was oftentimes played in a poison archetype version of the build during the 320 Forbidden Sanctum League. And good news for you, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this. Well, I have a good guess. I just don't know how many times to say it. Banana, nana, 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 nana. Anyway, he's got a wonderful video where he goes over the Poison Seismic Trap build version, what exactly it's going to look like with a couple of different adjustments looking forward into the 321 Crucible League. And overall, things are looking good. The video that is linked down below is a rather lengthy video where he goes into some tweaks that he's made, and the particular screenshot that I've snapped here takes place at roughly, I think, the 17-minute mark is what my notes are telling me. And at that point in time, he goes in, takes on an Elder on a 4-link Seismic Trap. So if you're wondering about, hey, is there still going to be good damage for this particular build? Is it still going to be viable in any way? He goes in with no Awakened Gems on a 4-link and does just fine. And he's kind of rambling even as he's running around the fight, not really taking any damage and just wiping things off the floor. The one big change in terms of feel behind the build is that rather than the build feeling like a hit version of a build with the nerfs and with the changes, it does feel a little bit more like a dot-based build. That's a quote coming from Banana. So just be aware of that. There is some level of feel that the gameplay will change on you. It will have a sort of visceral difference to you. You'll feel like you're playing more of a dot-based build rather than a hit, explosive, set a trap down and watch everything explode sort of build. But nonetheless, the damage is still there. It's still, believe it or not, a strong consideration despite the changes and the nerfs to this thing. It's still going to be something that players can and should consider for early pushing. As with all things with traps, it is very, very common for players to play it during the opening weekend of a league and then pivot onto a different playstyle for the rest of the league. So just be aware of that. As with all things, related to traps. Oftentimes, opening weekend is when something is most popular among players who are pushing for the ladder, which actually is a good data point for us to consider looking forward and making a prediction for 321 Crucible, that even though this did get a nerf, it's still relatively strong and might be worth playing at league start as you are pushing on early content. Depending on exactly how we interact with the Crucible mechanic itself, being able to preload damage and prepare for unleashing all sorts of hordes of goodies to drop and become experience on your weapons as you're interacting with the Crucible is also a very handy playstyle. So we're talking minions, we're talking totems, and we're talking traps that have a little bit of a delay like Seismic Trap. Explosive Arrow was another skill that was very popular during the Forbidden Sanctum League, and I have no doubts that it will once again be very popular. I think at this point in time, the biggest risk for Explosive Arrow not being in the top ranks of popularity across the board in terms of the opening league weekend, the biggest risk to it is actually nothing that happened in the patch notes or in what anybody's putting together in build guides. It's simply maybe players being fatigued by playing it because it seems like it's been consistent for a relatively long period of time in terms of Path of Exile, ages for league starter builds, and being ye old faithful might just mean that some players are kind of burnt out on it, but it also might mean that some players are actually getting used to it and are feeling confident and strong about the Explosive Arrow archetype and approaching it in a new league environment. Due to mastery changes, we do lose plus 20% to fire.multi, and that's nothing to sneeze at. It is some level of damage that the build is going to take a hit on, but for the most part, that's the biggest single change that we are seeing for Explosive Arrow, and so I expect it to be either popular in and of itself just by outright playstyle, i.e. totems and the Crucible, like what we were just talking about before with traps, minions, and totems, or, again, a certain level of comfortability among the player base, recognizing that Explosive Arrow is versatile both as an offensive DPS output in terms of consistent uptime of your damage, as well as keeping you rather mobile during those Crucible encounters and pushing on and taking down bosses early on over the opening weekend. The fact that you can play Explosive Arrow in so many different ways, I think also lends some of the popularity to the skill. You can play it on as a witch, as an elementalist, you can play it as a duelist, you can play it as a marauder. So there's a lot of flexibility built into the gem, into the playstyle. So if players have got an end game version of a particular build that they want to swap into, maybe they want to swap over and be something crazy like a berserker later on, or maybe they would really like to push a champion or a slayer later on, or maybe they'd like to move from maybe elementalist to a cultist or to a necromancer later on. There's flexibility and there's options there, and I think that's also some of the attractiveness of league starting with Explosive Arrow, is actually moving from one ascendancy to another if and as different builds emerge as very strong late games version of different ascendancies, but inside the same generic character build, therefore saving you from having to level up another character. Lastly, we did a comparison of super secret tech, Pulsterion and Zizran, and their various versions of Explosive Arrow. Again, there's more information for each of these guides for you to take a look at down below in the video description, depending on how you choose, if you do choose to approach your version of Explosive Arrow for your league start. Next up is everybody's favorite one-button build with some heavy air quotes there. Yes, I'm very aware you can add more buttons and more interactivity with Righteous Fire, but it is the classic, the quintessential one single button build. Move around and just let everything burn around you. And Pox, the everybody's favorite, master of Righteous Fire, has come out with a video with some lengthy and helpful descriptions about some tweaks and some changes to Righteous Fire overall, both to the playstyle as well as to the updates due to the patch notes and the particulars to a couple of different approaches with multiple different POBs. There's been a lot of discussion revolving around mana reservation, a lot of discussion revolving around the new masteries. Don't worry, Pox has got more than 20 minutes worth of info on this particular archetype. He's the go-to expert with any questions related to Righteous Fire. He's already got you covered with all of the different ways to reapproach, reimagine, and reinvest your time in playing Righteous Fire as a league starter for the opening weekend of 321 Crucible. Believe it or not, there's some good news here. Righteous Fire actually got some buffs with some additional 2% additional maximum elemental resistances that are now available to us on the tree with 321. And again, who knows kind of what weapons are going to look like based on Crucible, and who knows also what shields are going to look like based off of Crucible passives. And so overall, while there are some drawbacks and some nerfs and some changes, there's also some added bonuses and some added tools at the disposal of the Righteous Fire enthusiast to league start with in the upcoming Crucible League. Venom Gyre was relatively popular in two different forms, in the softcore forms of Path of Exile during league launch of Forbidden Sanctum, and I think, in making a prediction here, I think it's got only room to go up in terms of its popularity for the upcoming Crucible launch. Kobe Black Mamba has got a great video detailing all of the different changes that are coming with masteries, with the patch notes, and the related ascendancy changes as well, with potentially a buff going through with the new patch notes and with the new ascendancies for Pathfinder, actually strengthening one of the previously known weaknesses of Venom Gyre. The reason why I think Venom Gyre has got so much room to come up in terms of popularity for the 321 Crucible League is because of weapons. Because of the way how passives are going to work with the Crucible mechanic and passives on weapons, any attack-based skill or any skill that is going to take advantage of weapons has got huge potential. We don't know, we don't have all the data mined knowledge of what those passive trees are going to look like, so this is all pure speculation at this point. Out of any weapon-based skill that is going to be taking advantage of both the potential stance dance adrenaline hole stuff, but also taking advantage of the passives, which could be absurdly broken on weapons, then dual-wielding weapons might be the way to go, and Venom Gyre is a great opportunity that has already displayed itself as a top-end starter for attack-based characters. If Venom Gyre is only as strong as what it was during Forbidden Sanctum in 320, then it's already got good grounds and good legs to stand on as a strong league starter for the upcoming league. If it's any better, which we can all assume it's going to be just by the weapon passives alone, let alone any other changes that are also positively affecting the build, this is going to be a very strong hit-based approach to playing Path of Exile and starting your league strong. The next skill to predict and to discuss is Vortex, which everybody knows, of course, the expert and the madman behind the most comprehensive cold dot build archetype that's available on the discussion forums is Shack Central. And Vortex has got a number of different ways that it can be played. It's got a number of different skills and also can augment its damage. It is a wonderful dot archetype that can be played using multiple different ascendancies, using multiple different base characters. So just like how we were speaking earlier about Explosive Arrow and how you might have one particular league starter in mind for your opening weekend and then diverge into other more powerful late game versions of different builds that you want to try out or play, this particular approach, taking on Cold Dot, is another wonderful example of flexibility in your league starter. You can take something that has proven itself time and time again, literally for years at this point in Path of Exile's history as being a strong contender for a league starter. You can pick which style and which approach you would rather play. If you'd like a more active, button-heavy pressing version of the build, you can take that. If you want kind of more of a chill, lazy kind of approach to the build, then you can do that as well. You've got different characters that you can league start with in order to then branch out into those other builds you want to try later on in the league. Vortex and Cold Dot across the board hasn't received any major nerfs. None of the ascendancies that are used by this are particularly hampered in any way with the 321 patch notes. Overall, Cold Dot is still going to be a very, very strong consideration for all players across all different forms of Path of Exile, whether you're playing hardcore, softcore, solo self-found, or trade league. In any environment, Cold Dot is going to be a strong and reliable, dirt cheap way to get your league started. Our sixth skill to take a look at and make predictions about is Poisonous Concoction. Subtractum has got a wonderful video guide out displaying exactly how you can level, going through the leveling process using Poisonous Concoction, what sort of decisions you need to make as you are playing. There's several different build guides that are out there featuring Poisonous Concoction, but if you've never played it before and you want to get a feel and get a sense for how you progress through the first several acts of the campaign while playing Poisonous Concoction, then I highly recommend that you watch Subtractum's video on this discussion. Poisonous Concoction is very, very League Starter friendly, with nearly no uniques that even come to mind as you're leveling, other than just twink uniques that you'd be using on any other gear, which is not going to be available to us on League Start. So in terms of dirt cheap, in terms of accessible, and in terms of some scaling power that is dependent on some vendor recipes, which you can do simply by turning in flasks at your vendor shop in town, allows for your power scaling to go up with each act as your character progresses. It is a wonderfully fast and surprisingly strong League Starter that also can take you into maps and carry you all the way through a full-on endgame version of the build, or you can switch up from playing Poisonous Concoction to another endgame version of a build. Now, here's where the excitement also happens for anybody who's League starting and who's wondering about speed. If at any point in time you are looking for early League speed, then one of the best ways to do it is to take advantage of your flasks. You can get a whole bunch of speed off of your flasks, as well as a whole bunch of other stats off of your flasks early on in a league that would not be available to you except with better gear that you find, craft, or purchase. So one early way to address these relatively low levels of power in your character is to just soup up your flasks and then play the Flask Finder, the Pathfinder Ascendancy, and away you go, enjoying and delighting in all of the various tools that are now at your disposal and stats that are now available to you that otherwise wouldn't be in an early league scenario. The biggest choice for you if you're playing Poisonous Concoction is seriously going to be when to switch off of it or when to simply continue to scale it up and dump currency into it. Now, I can already hear some of you saying, but Poisonous Concoction doesn't take advantage of having a weapon slot, and so therefore isn't this going to be something that is at a disadvantage for the ongoing Crucible League? And because of the changes which Grinding Gear Games has announced, there's a couple of ways that you can get around this. Not saying that you're going to be able to use a weapon in conjunction with Poisonous Concoction, but rather you can have a weapon in your offhand slot, in your weapon slot, your weapon SWAT slot, say that 10 times fast, in order to make that weapon available for you to craft on Crucible. So even as you're league launching, even as you're in your opening weekend of your leagues, if you want to be messing around with Crucible and you're using Poisonous Concoction, you don't need to feel like you've wasted Crucible experience by not actually leveling up a weapon. You can do that in your weapon slot and in the recently answered questions interaction thread, which Grinding Gear Games is keeping updated. They've also announced that there's going to be a spot in your item stash on your character as you're walking around that will also be eligible for passive experience at the Crucible encounter. So a lot of the fears that players might have had of going in and playing Poisonous Concoction early on as a league starter and essentially cutting them off from accessing and interacting with the new fun league mechanic, those fears are dissuaded, and there's a lot of enjoyment still to be had here with a strong, reliable, and fast league starter that will allow you to interact with Crucible. Our last skill to make predictions about in this video today is Summon Raging Spirits, which I almost said Poisonous Summon Raging Spirits, because once that archetype was discovered and was really popularized during the 320 Forbidden Sanctum League, well, it was just off and running. Almost, it felt like everybody was playing it that could get their hands on the required pieces to play it. One of the discussions that we had around here last league was comparing DS Lilies, Baylor Mages, and K's various POBs, taking a look at the numbers, taking a look at their defensive offerings and their offensive offerings, and what were some of the differences between those different build guides, what were some of the differences in their gear choices, in their setups, and the different various tips and tricks that they were using to get the most out of their particular builds and their particular approach to playing Path of Exile as Poison SRS archetype players. Now, if you're going to league start, you're not going to have access right away, early on, to a whole bunch of the tools that make Poison SRS a thing. That being said, SRS in and of itself, without any chance to poison, let alone 100% chance to poison, is already a relatively smooth leveling experience for players to be able to progress and experience the power of SRS in conjunction with their power level growing with the passive tree and with their progression through the 10-act story campaign. That's a really long-winded and bearded way of saying, hey, the skill scales with you as the player as you progress. And so as long as you don't make massive mistakes on your passive tree, SRS, even without poison, is a decent way to level up your first character on opening weekend. There are even multiple different uniques, which are relatively common to drop if you're playing in a trade league environment, that can augment and help speed you up in your early league progression to be able to get to the spot where you then can farm either the currency or the items themselves to transition the build into a poison full-on SRS version. The biggest single hit that this build took in between 320 and 321 is the change to United and Dream, and that hit in and of itself, losing out on a bunch of minion increased damage, is not that big of a mitigating factor in terms of the damage. At the top end for all three of these POBs, I went in, plugged in the numbers with a new updated version of the unique weapon, and the reality is that it's about a 12 to 13% loss in damage. So what we're talking about is, instead of having 35 million DPS, you got 31. Instead of having 40 million DPS, you got like 35-ish. Instead of having 26-ish million DPS, you got somewhere between 21 to 22. Oh, bummer. That's still a fantastic top-end build that is going to delete bosses, and it is hardly anything that should dissuade you from league starting it, although it might be something for you to factor in later on if you are going to sink the time, the energy, and the currency into making this build all that it possibly could be in the 321 Crucible expansion. Once again, we don't know what the passives on weapons are going to look like, and so if minion wands or minion base types have got some pretty juicy passives there, then we might actually be making up for and exceeding that percentage of damage that we're losing off of the changes from 320 to 321 in the patch notes and in the changes to unique items. We still keep Envy. We still have the Covenant available to us. There's a lot of things still going for this archetype, so by no means is SRS dead. In fact, if anything, hopefully it means that maybe some players will be scared off from playing it. And so in a wild, delirious dream that I had the other night, Poison SRS was actually cheaper for me, and I was able to play it to my heart's content throughout the entirety of Crucible League. Oh, somebody wake me up. It's just too good of a dream. I know it's a dream. It won't happen. Well, thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. That's 7 different skills that we took a look at, evaluating the data coming from 320 Forbidden Sanctum and making some predictions about 321. I think all of these skills overall are going to be relatively popular as 5 links and as main skills going into the opening weekend. But, you know, I've made some mistakes in the past. Like the other day, my wife, Mrs. Draconis, said, hey, you should change something with your beard. And I took that to mean, okay, I'm going to shave the whole thing off. And now my children are shrieking at me every time they see me and they don't recognize me. So, you know, I've been wrong before, and I could be wrong with one of these 7 predictions, or maybe all of them here today. I'd love to hear your predictions down below in the comments about any of these particular skills or skills you think might be strong in the upcoming 321 Crucible expansion. I'd also love to know if there's anything that's disappointing to you about the patch notes. Maybe there was something that came through that got nerfed that you wish didn't, or maybe you thought was heavy-handed, or maybe something didn't get nerfed that you've been crying about for the last several leagues. Drop me a comment down below, and I'd love to interact with you in the comment section there. Thanks once again for joining us, and I hope the upcoming 321 Crucible League is the league. A Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.